Sri Lanka, a beautiful island off the southeast coast of India. It was once described as a pearl drop in the Indian Ocean, but after reading this article, a blood drop would be more appropriate. 20,000 civilians killed in the final days of the war. My neighbour down the road, Aparna, has family in Sri Lanka. She is Tamil. I'm going to speak to her about this because I'd like to know more.
Within 1.5 square kilometer area, more than 100,000 civilians were in the safety zone, were trapped in there, and government, Sri Lankan army has cornered them within that 1.5 square kilometer area and used mass destruction weapons, causing really high casualties. From that day, there were no doctors, there were no medical staff. ICRC suspended the operation a few days before that. So simply there was nobody to help those who got injured.
சண்டை கடுமையா நடந்து கொண்டிருக்கான். நிறைய மக்கள் செத்து கொண்டிருக்கிறான். எங்களுடைய கூண்டுக்குள்ள கிட்டத்தட்ட ஒரு 2 கிலோமீட்டர் நீள அகலமான துண்டுக்குள்ள கடுமையான யுத்தம் நடந்து கொண்டிருக்கின்றது. அதாவது எல்லா இடமும் குவியல்கள் எல்லா இடமும் நடந்து எல்லா இடம் மக்களையும் வெளியேற விடாமல் நாங்கள் மக்களை நாங்கள் நேற்று கேட்கிறாங்க.
After meeting Aparna, I decided to investigate further the crisis in Sri Lanka, to know more about the plight of these people, why it happened, to understand why these poor people are suffering the way they are.
The government did at that time, they were telling this is the safety zone, so people can come there, and when people went there, they bombed that area and shelled it.
So they pushed all the people into that tiny strip of the land, and they started to use cluster bombs, chemical bombs, and all sort of heavy weaponry, regardless of women, children.
And these are civilians.
I'm talking about civilians.
Well, what is your assessment on how the Sri Lankan government conducted itself?
I would say it was brutal, particularly in terms of civilians. I've covered a lot of conflicts, and armies fight, soldiers die. Both the Sri Lankan army and the Tamil Tigers were military forces. But the Sri Lankan army, when it was, it vowed to eradicate the Tamil Tigers, knew that there were literally several tens of thousands of civilians, men, women, little kids, living in hand-dug trenches. They were systematically bombed with absolutely no regard to their lives. Brutally, every day. Hospitals were bombed. The UN hospital was hit. By the end of the conflict, the few doctors who stayed, at huge risk to their own lives, were hanging IV lines from just trees to try to treat people. They had run out of medicine, and yet the bombing of civilians continued, and the Sri Lankan government lied about it and lied about it and lied about it and said there were no bombs, there was no shelling. There's evidence of it. No responsibility or care for their civilians.
I've been reading about these IDPs, internally displaced people camps. What's your understanding of them?
IDP camps, so-called IDP camps, are more like the Nazi-style concentration camps. That these 300,000 Tamil civilians are detained in by the Sri Lankan army, run by the government of Sri Lanka, where men and women are separated in most of the camps, and no access for the international aid groups to get in to help them. People are without food, like proper food, like clean water, living under really poor sanitary facilities. For example, I hear through a news a couple of days ago that about 200 people have to share one toilet. Another major problem is the disappearances of people there. Younger men and younger women are separated from the families and taken away from them for inquiries, and I hear that they don't return. My uncle has 3 sons and 2 daughters. And they've taken away 2 of his sons just because they are Tamils and they are young, so they are seen as criminals and taken away. I mean, that's not the point. The point is, where are they?
There were 13,100 youngsters missing.
They are doing it for a purpose. They are calling it screening. They wanted to destroy the younger generation of Tamils. So if there's accountability, that means if they make some accounts, how many people are inside the camp, then there can't be any disappearance. So what they try to do is, they try to eliminate the young generation before they have given access to the foreign organization.
And there is evidence that young men, particularly, and some young women are being taken out of the camps, suspected of being Tamil Tigers. No one knows what's happened to them. It's a terrible situation. These are essentially concentration camps.
It's for how long the Sri Lankan government feel they can keep the world's eyes closed, with the removal of all the young men and a lot of the young women and what's happening to them. At the moment their justification would be that they are going into the camps to remove those people they consider to be tigers. At the end of it has got to, that
Will be
that
tigers of
can't-
the future.
Yeah, you can't carry that argument on indefinitely. No. And you're absolutely right. These IDP camps are the breeding ground for the next generation.
Of course.
And that's what you would imagine the Sri Lankan government have got to understand.
To understand this crisis, I need to learn about Sri Lanka's past history, about the country's cultural background.
We had our own kingdom. The Sinhalese had their own kingdom, but most of the time, one kingdom rules the whole country. And between 1215 and 1469 or something, the Tamil kingdom, which ruled the whole country. And there was a bit of a lapse before the Portuguese came in 1505, when the Sinhalese kingdom was the main ruler in the south. But still, we had our own king in Jaffna, and also the principalities around in Batticaloa and Vavonia, or we call it Vanni.
But anyway, in 1505, Portuguese came. At that time, in Colombo there was a Sinhalese kingdom, and in Jaffna there was a Tamil kingdom, and in the central part of Sri Lanka, which is called, which is an upcountry, hilly area, and Kandy is the town there. So there was another kingdom there, and Kandy was the one controlling the eastern part of Sri Lanka. So naturally, the Jaffna kingdom was purely Tamils, the Colombo kingdom was purely Sinhalese, and the Kandian kingdom was Tamils and Sinhalese. Then in 1796, British came. They captured all from the Dutch. They were trying to capture the Kandian kingdom, and in 1815, they captured the Kandian kingdom. And so in 1815, the entire island was under British. And in 1833, he amalgamated the Sinhalese areas and Tamil areas as one country. And that was the basic, I would say, the very first, the seed of our problem. When we got independence, even though we are two nations, two separate kingdoms in a way, and we became the minority under the umbrella of independence or democracy. So within the parliament, they are 70%, we were 30%.
So we have this democracy, electoral democracy, majority wins. So the first Prime Minister Sri Lanka said, look, the British have taken the lands away from the peasantry. We must do something about that. And in his mind also was, these plantation workers came from India in the 19th century. they are really foreigners. We must send them back. So two things happened. And the myth grew because the plantation estates, tea estates, were where a lot of the agricultural land was. The myth grew not that the British had taken the land, but the Indian Tamil worker, the plantation workers, had taken the Sinhalese land. So he did two things, killed two birds with one stone. He decitizenized the plantation workers, or refused them citizenship in the future. And he began an agricultural scheme in the northeast to settle Sinhala people. It's very important to understand that. That was the beginning of demographic changes, which later comes to the eastern province. Demographic changes and decitizenization. First, discrimination. In 1956, a person not directly in line of succession, S.W.R.D. Bandaranaike, who was a poorer relative, so to speak, he thought the best way of getting power quickly, because he was not going to succeed the dynasties in a hurry, quickly was to get the electorate on his side with Sinhalese as a language, official language, Buddhism as a state religion.
Well, when our country became independent, naturally the question arose of national language superseding English as the official language of the country. Sinhalese we decided upon as the official language because 70% of the people of Ceylon are Sinhalese. At the same time, we naturally realized that the Tamil minority had a language that was also old, a very rich language in literature, so on. And therefore we decided also to give a reasonable use to the Tamil language as a language of a national minority.
He said we will have reasonable use of Tamil because he didn't want, he was still trying to be nice. And that is when the Buddhist priest said, no reasonable use of Tamil. We won't have it. And they gathered before his house and persuaded him not, so he relented and said, okay, no reasonable use of Tamil. But that didn't save him from the monk's bullet. So he was assassinated. So we have the monks coming into power, bringing the army and the police against the Tamils from then on. Right? And any time that there was a Tamil protest or Tamil this thing, they let go, not so much the army, as the unofficial army, the thugs, the gundas. Each minister had his own private army.
In 1958, there were more than 3,000 people lost their lives and over 20,000 displaced from the south, and they were all shipped to their homeland called North and East. Legislations passed to prevent people getting into civil service, into university education, and the university people who couldn't get in, there was a discrimination on the marks first, and still they found there was a gap between the Tamils and Sinhalese. The Tamil had to score about 50 marks more than the Sinhalese to get into the university. Still they found there were too many Tamils getting in, so they brought in region by province, so many people can come in only from these provinces.
And of course, the Tamils were again out of proportion in the professions. They were more, in terms of population ratio, there were more Tamils who were lawyers and doctors and dentists and professionals, simply because education was the only thing they had. And language was tied up with education. And if you had to go in the Sinhalese medium, the whole educational establishment was shut to you. And if you had standardization, you had difficulty to get to university. So there is an escalation of struggles. You see, the government tries to stay in power, brings in more laws. So you start with a little discrimination here, and an institutional racism there. And then you see, you take away your language, you take away my employment, you take away my education. If you take away my education, you take away my employment. If you take away my employment, you take away my sustenance of my families. What have I got left?
By the Sinhalese was to burn the most what they call sought out library in the Southeast Asia, which had 97,000 volumes of books, some of them written in all our lives long before Christ.
My word.
Okay, they all ended up as ashes, and then we could see how it developed into 1983 pogrom, the worst July, when many lost their lives, and many millions of pounds worth of businesses, houses for the town people were just set up, just fire, burned to ashes.
So after I got into the bus only, I realized I made a big mistake, because as I can understand the language, Sinhalese language, the people inside the bus, they are talking about how they torture or how they kill Tamils inside. So they are talking between them. So I realized that I'm in a very dangerous place rather than outside. So I got down in the next bus halt. I started to walk along the street where the burning shops and the people are got killed. I walked more or less 7 miles on that particular day. I'm in my early 20s, I was crying.
There were pogroms. You see, it's called wrong to call these race riots. There are pogroms in 58, 77, 79, 81, 83. Every government, one after the other, tightened the screws on the Tamil peoples. Right. And they tightened them till there was nothing left.
But what happens now? After 60 years of ethnic cleansing and more than 30 years of civil war, what can we do in Britain and the rest of the world to stop this injustice? Are these marches and rallies enough? Are governments listening? Have we still not learned from other conflicts in recent times?
We want that genocide to stop right now, so that's why we're protesting here, and to free all the Tamils from the camp.
Fundamental issues of the Tamils in the country, the aspirations of Tamils, they have not met. And international community again has to really engage in brokering something in between the Tamils and the government to address the fundamental issues of Tamils, to bring to get them their right for self-determination.
You have to resolve it. There's never been a civil war in the world that's been resolved by military means for any length of time. In the end, it always comes back to politics.
The only way to end what is a conflict would be a political solution. Any conflict only ends with a political solution. The Tamil Tigers have now, the remains of the Tamil Tigers, Tamil representatives, whatever you want to call them, the political people still exist. They've set up, or are in the process of setting up, a transitional government that will be outside, obviously have the same issues, and they want to proceed into political negotiations. I think that is absolutely the only way forward, and it depends on whether the Sri Lankan government is going to savor and exult in this rather bloody victory, or address the issues that concern Tamils in Sri Lanka who are Sri Lankan citizens.
Without addressing that, there's no end to this.